The bruises bloomed under the housekeeper's hands when Calder Rowe walked in. His 9-year-old stood still, not crying, counting in Spanish, long sleeves in June. Maribel Ortega's fingers pressed rhythmically against Inez's forearms, while Calder's throat locked shut. But what came next destroyed everything he thought he'd seen. The bruises hadn't started in his house, they came from school, from 4 months of another child's violence that no one had stopped. The counting wasn't punishment. It was regulation, a technique Maribel learned at a respite center, teaching his daughter to survive panic attacks from trauma the school had documented and buried. The incident reports Calder ignored. Carefully worded to protect the district, not the children. Drop a comment where you're watching from and subscribe before you miss the signs schools hide behind policy language. Because Calder is about to discover how many children get relocated instead of helped when systems decide fixing costs more than moving the problem. The house was cold when Calder Rowe came through the garage door, cold enough that he noticed because his daughter was wearing long sleeves in June, and the sound coming from the living room didn't match what he expected to find. Not crying, not silence. Counting, low and steady, in Spanish. Numbers he didn't recognize layered under shallow breathing that came in bursts he could track from 15 feet away. His keys were still in his hand when he stopped at the base of the stairs and saw Maribel Ortega's fingers moving fast against Inez's forearms, pressing down in rhythm, while his 9-year-old stood there with her eyes half closed, and the bruises blooming dark under the fabric made his throat close before his mind could catch up to what his body already understood. He moved without deciding to move, crossed the room in 4 steps that felt like falling forward, and the words came out flat and certain, the way they do when a man has rehearsed them in his head for years without knowing he was waiting for the moment to use them. Step away from her. Now. Maribel's hands froze mid-press, fingers still curved against Inez's skin, and she didn't pull back the way someone caught would pull back, didn't flinch or make excuses or try to explain, just lifted her palms slowly, with the kind of care that comes from being taught that sudden movements cost more than stillness ever will. She said his name, Calder, not Mr. Rowe, and her voice had the texture of someone trying not to lose their footing on ice, trying to reach across a distance that had already opened too wide to cross with words alone. Calder pulled Inez into his chest and felt her ribs jump under his hands, felt the way her body held itself tense like she'd been holding it tense for longer than this moment, longer than today. And when he looked at the bruises again, they were worse than he'd first seen, darker, spreading in patterns that suggested repetition, that suggested this wasn't the first time someone's hands had been on his daughter without his knowledge or consent. He looked at Maribel, then at the staircase where the counting had stopped at 8, then back at the woman who had worked in his home for 3 years and somehow become someone he didn't know at all. There were questions forming in the space between them, questions about how long and how often and why Inez hadn't said anything. But he didn't ask them because asking meant waiting for answers, and waiting meant giving Maribel time to construct a story that would make this look like something other than what it was. He told her to pack her things and be gone by morning, and his voice came out the way it did in board meetings when he needed people to understand that the decision had already been made and their opinions wouldn't change the outcome. Maribel's face did something complicated, something that looked like grief mixed with recognition, like she'd been expecting this moment and had still hoped it wouldn't come, and she nodded once before turning toward the hallway that led to the small room off the kitchen where she kept her belongings. Calder watched her go and felt Inez's breathing start to even out against his shirt, felt the way his daughter's fingers gripped the fabric at his sides, and he wanted to ask her what happened, wanted to know how long this had been going on and why she'd hidden it from him. But when he opened his mouth, the only thing that came out was a sound he didn't recognize as his own voice. The counting started again upstairs after Maribel's footsteps faded, softer this time, almost a whisper, and Calder stood there holding his daughter and trying to remember the last time he'd been home early enough to hear what happened in his house when he wasn't there. The bruises felt like evidence of something larger than this moment. Evidence of a pattern he'd missed while flying between Oklahoma City and Bentonville and Newark. While conference calls took precedence over bedtime stories and quarterly reports mattered more than the question of who was putting his daughter to bed and whether she felt safe when the lights went out. Subscribe before you miss the warning signs that matter more than the ones you're trained to see. He asked Inez who did this to her, asked it gently while stroking her hair the way he used to when she was small enough to fit in the curve of one arm, and she said a name he didn't recognize, said it so quietly he had to ask her to repeat it, and then she stopped talking altogether and pressed her face into his chest like she was trying to disappear into a space where questions couldn't follow. Maribel left through the front door an hour before dawn with 2 canvas bags and a box that didn't close properly, and Calder watched from the kitchen window while Inez slept upstairs with her door cracked open the way she used to when she was afraid of storms. The woman moved like someone who'd practiced leaving quickly, who'd learned to keep possessions light and exits clear, and when her taillights disappeared past the security gate, Calder felt something twist in his chest that wasn't relief or victory or the satisfaction of having protected what mattered. It felt closer to doubt, to the sensation of having acted on certainty that was already starting to corrode around the edges, but he pushed it down and focused on the more immediate problem of his daughter, who hadn't spoken since saying that name he didn't recognize and then going silent in a way that suggested the silence had weight, had purpose, had been there longer than just tonight. The pediatric urgent care off South Yale Avenue opened at 7, and Calder carried Inez through the parking lot, even though she was 9 and perfectly capable of walking, carried her because she let him, and because holding her made him feel like he was doing something useful, while the fluorescent lights overhead turned her skin the color of old paper. The physician assistant who examined her had a pen that clicked too loud in the small room, clicked every time she made a notation on the tablet that recorded bruises in clinical language that stripped away the rage Calder had felt, standing in his living room watching someone else's hands on his daughter's arms. Contusions, multiple, various stages of healing, pattern consistent with grip pressure, no indication of fractures on preliminary examination, recommend X-ray to confirm, recommend follow-up with pediatrician, recommend documentation for potential further action that the assistant didn't specify, but that hung in the air between them like smoke. The X-ray came back clean 20 minutes later, and the technician who read it said Inez was lucky in a tone that suggested she didn't understand what luck meant in this context, didn't understand that clean bones didn't erase the fact that someone had put their hands on a child hard enough to leave marks that darkened over days. Calder signed forms he didn't read and accepted printed instructions for wound care that assumed the wounds would heal and that healing was the endpoint rather than the beginning of questions he didn't know how to ask. Subscribe so you recognize when silence is a symptom, not a choice. Inez stayed quiet through all of it, stayed quiet while they walked to the car and while Calder adjusted the rearview mirror and tried to figure out what to say to a daughter who looked at him like he was someone she was still deciding whether to trust. The silence stretched past Catoosa, past the truck stops and the outlet mall where he'd promised to take her back when she was 7 and never followed through, past the places that marked the distance between his office downtown and the house he'd bought because it had good schools and a yard big enough for the swing set he'd never assembled. Inez stared out the window at landscape she'd seen 1,000 times, and Calder wanted to fill the quiet with reassurance or explanations or promises that he'd make this right. But everything he thought to say sounded hollow before it reached his mouth. He was trying to formulate a question that wouldn't sound like an interrogation when Inez finally spoke, and what she said wasn't what he expected. She asked if Maribel would still bring her notebook back, asked it without looking at him, her voice so small he had to replay the words in his head to make sure he'd heard correctly. The notebook. Not, "I'm sorry," or "I'm scared," or "Why did you send her away?" but a question about an object Calder didn't know existed. Something Maribel had that apparently mattered more than the bruises, or the medical visit, or the fact that the woman who'd caused this was gone and wouldn't be coming back. He said no. Said it because it was the truth, and because lying to her now would be another kind of failure. And when he looked over at Inez, her face had done something that made his throat burn the way it had in the living room when he'd pulled her away from Maribel's hands. He asked what was in the notebook, asked it carefully, and Inez turned back to the window and didn't answer. And Calder understood in that moment that whatever he thought he'd solved by sending Maribel away was actually just the beginning of a problem he didn't yet have the language to name. Calder found the notebook in Inez's backpack 3 days later, while searching for the school directory he should have consulted months ago. Found it wedged between a math workbook and a folder of drawings that showed stick figures holding hands under trees that looked more like clouds. The cover was plain brown, spiral-bound, the kind sold in grocery stores for $2, and when he opened it, expecting to find homework or doodles, he found instead something that looked like medical documentation produced by someone who understood anatomy but had learned to draw it from memory rather than textbooks. Pages of careful diagrams showing hands, human hands rendered in pencil with arrows indicating pressure points, numbers written beside each arrow in handwriting that was too precise to belong to a child. 1 through 16. Locations marked on simplified drawings of forearms, wrists, the soft space between thumb and forefinger. In the margins, dates and places written in Inez's looping print: Bartlesville, November 8th, Joplin, November 22nd, Benton County, December 3rd. Places Calder recognized because he'd been to all of them for meetings, for site visits, for the work that kept him away from home, and apparently kept him ignorant of what happened in his absence. He turned pages and found more diagrams, these showing breathing patterns represented as waves with counts marked at peaks and valleys, showing body positions that looked like yoga poses, but were labeled with terms he didn't recognize. Grounding and bilateral, and something called havening that sounded made up, until he saw the citation at the bottom of the page, referencing a research paper from a university he'd donated to, without ever reading what they studied. The handwriting shifted between pages, adult precision alternating with child printing, like two people had been working in the same notebook toward the same goal. And when Calder reached the last page with writing on it, he found a single sentence in Maribel's careful script: "Count to 8. When your body forgets how to be still." He called the pediatrician's office before he understood what he was calling about, got transferred twice before reaching the physician assistant who documented Inez's bruises with that clicking pen, and when she answered he asked a question he hadn't known he needed to ask until the words were already out. He asked if there were therapeutic techniques that involved applying pressure to specific points on a child's body, asked if counting in another language could serve a medical purpose, asked if what he'd interpreted as violence could have been something else entirely, and the silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that Calder thought the call had dropped. When the assistant finally spoke, her voice had changed, had moved from clinical efficiency to something that sounded like recognition mixed with concern, and she asked him to bring the notebook to the office, asked if he could come in that afternoon, asked in a way that made it clear this wasn't optional. The physician who examined the notebook wasn't the assistant, but someone older, someone whose nameplate read Dr. Yolanda Chen, and whose office contained enough books that Calder understood this was a person who had spent years studying things he'd never thought to wonder about. She turned pages slowly, made notes on her own tablet, asked questions about Maribel's background that Calder couldn't answer because he'd never asked, had never thought to ask, had hired someone to care for his daughter, and then assumed that paying her was the same as knowing her. Dr. Chen explained that what he'd witnessed wasn't discipline or abuse, but regulation, a technique used to interrupt panic responses in children who'd experienced trauma or overwhelming stress, that the counting in Spanish created cognitive distance, while the pressure points triggered parasympathetic response, and Calder heard the words, but couldn't make them align with the certainty he'd felt watching Maribel's hands on Inez's arms. He asked how someone learned to do this. Asked it because he needed to understand how he'd gotten everything so catastrophically wrong. And Dr. Chen said people learned it in places where they'd needed it themselves, in facilities that served populations most people didn't think about until crisis forced them to pay attention. She asked if Maribel had mentioned working in behavioral health or trauma services, asked if there was any indication she'd been trained in crisis intervention, and Calder realized he'd never asked Maribel anything beyond whether she could cook meals his daughter would eat and whether she had references he could check. Subscribe before you mistake protection for harm, because you never learn to ask the right questions. The doctor's face had done something complicated when he mentioned the bruises on Inez's arms, had shifted from professional neutrality to the kind of concern that preceded difficult conversations, and she asked if Calder had considered that the marks might not have originated in his home at all. The question hung between them like a physical thing, heavy and unavoidable, and Calder felt the architecture of his certainty begin to collapse in a way that couldn't be stopped or reversed. He asked what she meant, though he already knew, already understood in the space between her question and his response, that he'd been so focused on protecting his daughter from the wrong threat that he'd missed the actual danger entirely. Dr. Chen said that children who needed regulation techniques usually needed them because something had taught them to be afraid, something that happened regularly enough that their bodies had learned to expect it, and the places in Inez's notebook weren't random. They were locations where his daughter had been when her body forgot how to be still, and someone had been there to count her back to safety while Calder was busy being important somewhere else. Calder found Maribel in a walk-up apartment off Admiral Place where the stairs smelled like cooking oil and the hallway carpet had worn through to concrete in the high-traffic areas. Found her surrounded by boxes that were half-taped, like she'd started packing with purpose, and then lost momentum somewhere between the kitchen and the single bedroom, visible through an open door. She didn't look surprised when she opened the door and saw him standing there with the notebook in his hands, didn't look angry or vindicated, or any of the things he'd expected from someone who'd been wrongly accused and dismissed without explanation. She looked tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep, tired in the way people get when they've been carrying weight for so long they've forgotten what it feels like to put it down. And when she stepped back to let him enter, she did it without speaking, without asking why he'd come or what he wanted, like she'd been waiting for this moment and had already decided not to waste energy on questions that would answer themselves. He tried to apologize, and the words came out wrong, came out sounding like he was asking for forgiveness, when what he actually needed was understanding, needed her to explain how he'd missed everything that mattered while being present for nothing that did. Maribel listened without interrupting, stood near the kitchen counter with her arms crossed in a way that looked more like self-protection than defiance. And when he finally stopped talking, she held out her hands palm up and let him see the scars that crossed her wrists like rivers on a map, white lines that had faded but not disappeared, that told a story she didn't need to narrate because the evidence was written on her skin. She said 3 years at a respite center in McAllister after her younger sister died on a bus outside Norman, said it without elaborating, without providing details that would make the story easier to digest or give him space to offer condolences that wouldn't change what had happened or what she'd learned from it. The respite center had served children who needed breaks from homes that couldn't handle their needs, children whose bodies had learned to respond to stress in ways that looked like defiance or manipulation, but were actually survival mechanisms that no one had taught them to regulate. Maribel had learned to count in Spanish because English carried too much weight for children who associated the language with commands and consequences, had learned where to apply pressure because someone had shown her during her own crisis, and it had worked when nothing else did. She explained that Inez had been coming home with bruises since October, had started flinching at sudden movements and asking questions about whether it was normal to feel scared when nothing scary was happening, and the school had sent notes full of language about behavioral interventions and conflict resolution strategies that sounded helpful and meant absolutely nothing. Calder asked why she hadn't told him, asked it even though he knew the answer, knew that he'd made himself unavailable in ways that went beyond physical absence, that he'd responded to every question about Inez with assurances that she was fine, because believing she was fine was easier than restructuring his schedule around the possibility that she wasn't. Maribel said she'd tried twice, said it matter-of-factly, and when he started to protest, she named the dates September 19th and October 3rd, and he remembered both conversations, remembered cutting them short, because he'd been late for calls that had seemed urgent at the time, and now felt like evidence of priority systems that had been inverted for so long, he'd stopped noticing they were upside down. He asked if she would stay, asked it because the alternative was leaving his daughter with someone new who wouldn't know what Inez needed or how to provide it. And Maribel's face did something that looked like she was doing calculations that had nothing to do with money or logistics. She said yes, but set conditions. Said she'd stay if he learned to show up, if he learned to listen when his daughter spoke in ways that didn't involve words, if he learned to recognize that paying for care wasn't the same as providing it. Subscribe before you learn this lesson when the cost is measured in damage already done. Calder agreed to all of it, felt the weight of the agreement settle on him like something he'd been avoiding and could no longer dodge, and when Maribel offered him coffee, he said yes, even though he didn't want it, said yes, because refusing felt like walking away from an opportunity he wouldn't get twice. He drove her back to his house that evening, after helping her unpack the boxes she'd spent 3 days filling, and in the car, she asked if Inez still liked mango with chili powder the way she had last summer. Calder's hands tightened on the steering wheel before he could stop them. Tightened because he didn't know the answer, didn't know what his daughter liked or didn't like, beyond the basics he'd memorized years ago and never updated. Maribel smiled, not unkindly, and said Inez would never tell him that herself, would wait for him to notice or ask, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any of the words they'd exchanged in her apartment. When he dropped Maribel off and watched her climb the stairs to collect the last of her things, Calder understood that knowing how to count to 8 in Spanish wouldn't matter if he still didn't know who had taught his daughter. She needed counting in the first place. The neurologist in Newark had an office on the 14th floor of a medical building that overlooked the Passaic River, and Calder had scheduled the appointment during a layover between meetings because fitting his daughter into the margins of his business travel felt like the kind of compromise he'd been making for years without recognizing it as failure. Dr. Catherine Voss spent 40 minutes with Inez in an examination room that had toys no child past the age of 5 would touch. And when she emerged, she asked to speak with Calder, alone, in a way that made it clear the conversation would require privacy and preparation he didn't have. She explained that Inez wasn't fragile or damaged in the way he seemed to fear, wasn't carrying scars that would define her permanently, but she was carrying a load that wasn't hers to carry, a weight that belonged to systems and adults, and institutional failures that had somehow become a 9-year-old's responsibility to manage. Doctor, Voss spoke in language that was precise without being clinical, direct without being cruel, And when she asked the question that had been circling since Calder first opened that notebook, she asked it in a way that suggested she already knew he wouldn't have an answer. Why had the school not intervened when intervention was the only reasonable response to what was happening? Calder said he didn't know, said it because admitting ignorance felt better than constructing excuses. And Dr. Voss made a note on her tablet before looking up with an expression that combined professional concern with something that looked like personal frustration. She told him that Inez had a psychological evaluation scheduled in 10 days through the school district, an evaluation that would determine whether she qualified for behavioral support services, and that the current documentation suggested the assessment would classify her as a child with emotional regulation deficits rather than a child who'd been subjected to circumstances that required regulation. The distinction mattered because one label followed students through their academic careers and into college applications, became part of permanent records that determined opportunities and shaped how teachers and administrators interpreted every future behavior, while the other label required the school to acknowledge their own failure to protect. Calder felt his throat close, the way it had when Inez asked about the notebook, felt the weight of a 10-day deadline settle on him like something he should have seen coming, but had somehow missed until it was already too late to avoid. He asked what would happen if he refused the evaluation, asked it knowing the answer wouldn't be simple, and Dr. Voss explained that refusal would trigger a different kind of scrutiny, would raise questions about whether he was interfering with his daughter's access to services she might need, would position him as an obstacle rather than an advocate. Subscribe Before Bureaucracy writes a story about your child that has nothing to do with truth and everything to do with protecting the people who failed them. The neurologist said his best option was to document everything, to build a counter-narrative that explained what had actually happened and who bore responsibility, to create a record that was more complete than whatever the school had filed. She asked if he'd reviewed the incident reports or contacted the district office, asked it in a way that suggested she already knew he hadn't. And when Calder admitted he'd assumed someone else had handled it, she said nothing, just wrote something else on her tablet that he couldn't see from his angle across the desk. The flight back to Oklahoma gave Calder 3 hours to think and 4 hours to act once he landed, and he spent both doing what he should have done months ago, requesting records from Inez's school, reviewing email chains he'd ignored because they'd seemed like routine administrative updates, calling the principal's office, and being transferred to voicemail systems that promised return calls within 48 hours. What he found in the documentation the school sent over wasn't absence of information, but careful construction of narrative that positioned his daughter as participant rather than victim, that described incidents in language designed to distribute blame in ways that protected the institution. There were notes about Inez's difficulty focusing during transitions, about her tendency to withdraw when confronted, about concerns regarding her social integration that read like problems she'd brought with her rather than problems the school had failed to address. There were incident reports filed by teachers who'd witnessed conflicts but had documented them as mutual disagreements, as situations where both children needed support rather than situations where one child needed protection from another. What wasn't in the records was more revealing than what was. No documentation of injuries reported to the school nurse. No follow-up meetings with parents of the other child involved. No behavioral intervention plans that named the actual source of Inez's stress. Instead, there were gaps, careful omissions, references to meetings that had no attached notes, and a paper trail that stopped abruptly in November when Maribel must have started the regulation training because there was nothing else available that would help. Calder called the school district office in Tulsa and got transferred to a risk management specialist whose title alone told him everything he needed to know about how seriously they were taking this. And when he mentioned the evaluation scheduled for 10 days out, the specialist's voice changed from bureaucratic efficiency to something that sounded like strategic concern. She asked if he'd considered requesting the assessment be conducted by an independent evaluator, asked it carefully, and Calder understood in that moment that the system had already decided what story they needed to tell, and his daughter was just a character they were writing to fit the plot. He asked where the other child was now, asked what interventions had been implemented to address the actual problem, and the silence on the other end lasted long enough that he knew the answer before she gave it. The specialist said she couldn't discuss other students, couldn't share information that was protected by privacy regulations, but that the district was committed to creating safe learning environments for all children. The language was so careful, so precisely emptied of meaning, that Calder hung up and went back to the documents spread across his kitchen table, went back to the gaps and omissions, until he found what they'd been trying to hide in plain sight. Buried in a transfer notification dated November 14th was a student identification number that didn't match Inez's, attached to a form requesting educational records be forwarded to Indian River School District in Sussex County, Delaware. No name, no explanation, just a number and a destination, and a date that aligned perfectly with when the incidents had stopped being documented in Tulsa. Calder pulled up the district website and found a phone number for their special services coordinator, found himself looking at a map that showed Sussex County was 4 states away, and wondering what kind of intervention involved relocating a child across half the country without addressing why relocation had become necessary. He had 10 days before Inez's evaluation, and a paper trail that led to Delaware, and somewhere in Sussex County was a child whose file would tell him everything the Tulsa schools had worked so hard to keep buried. The conference room in the Indian River School District Administration Building smelled like industrial carpet cleaner, and the kind of air freshener that suggested something underneath needed masking, and the 3 people waiting when Calder arrived had arranged themselves in positions that communicated hierarchy before anyone spoke a word. Principal Gerald Hutchins sat at the head of the table with a leather portfolio that looked expensive enough to signal authority. A woman introduced as Diane Colbert from the district's Special Services Division sat to his right with a tablet she'd already turned face down. And the caseworker who'd been copied on the transfer documentation sat furthest from the door, with her hands folded on a file folder that was considerably thicker than anything Calder had received from Tulsa. Her name was Vivian Torres, and when she made eye contact with Calder, there was something in her expression that looked less like professional courtesy and more like apology offered in advance of something she knew would require it. Hutchins started with the language Calder had already learned to recognize as institutional self-protection, phrases about confidentiality and appropriate channels, and the district's commitment to supporting all learners in ways that respected privacy while maintaining safety, and Calder let him talk until the principal ran out of prepared statements and had to acknowledge that the man sitting across from him had flown from Oklahoma, specifically because the appropriate channels had failed so completely that a 9-year-old girl had been taught to count her way through panic attacks, while the adults responsible for preventing them had been filing transfer paperwork. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Diane Colbert shifted in her seat and looked at Vivian Torres in a way that suggested she was transferring responsibility for whatever came next. And when Torres finally opened the file folder, Calder saw pages that had been redacted in places, but not thoroughly enough to hide the story they told. The child's name had been blacked out, but his student identification number matched the one Calder had found in the Tulsa transfer notification, and the timeline documented in incident reports and behavioral assessments painted a picture of a boy who'd been moved not twice, but 4 times in 3 years, starting in Salina, Kansas, before a relocation to Topeka that lasted 6 months, then a brief placement in Tulsa that had ended with the transfer to Sussex County in November. Each move had been preceded by incidents that were described in careful language about difficulty with emotional regulation and challenges during unstructured time and responses to perceived threats that were disproportionate to actual danger. And nowhere in the documentation was there any mention of the word that would have required the schools to provide actual intervention instead of geographic solutions. The boy wasn't classified as dangerous. He was classified as struggling, which meant he could be moved without triggering the kind of scrutiny that would expose how completely the system had failed both him and every child who'd been hurt, while administrators decided that relocation was cheaper than treatment. Torres explained, without being asked, that the child's mother worked night shifts at a poultry processing plant in Georgetown, worked them because day shifts didn't pay enough to cover rent and the specialized childcare her son needed, and that the IEP that had been drafted in Topeka had never been funded because funding required diagnostic assessments that required appointments the mother couldn't make because missing work meant losing the job that kept them housed. Subscribe before you understand that some children don't get help because the system has decided their parents don't deserve the time to ask for it. The caseworker's voice had developed an edge that suggested she'd made this explanation before to people who had more power to change things than Calder did. And when Hutchins tried to interrupt with something about resource allocation and competing priorities, Torres kept talking, kept explaining that the boy had been placed in Sussex County because his grandmother lived in Seaford and had agreed to take him after school until his mother finished her shift at midnight, and that the placement had been working until 3 weeks ago when the grandmother had a stroke and the boy had gone back to coming home to an empty apartment and whatever happened in his head between 3:15 and whenever his Coron mother got home. Calder asked what interventions were currently in place, asked it because he needed to know if anyone was actually helping this child or if they were just waiting for the next incident that would justify another transfer, and the silence that followed was answer enough. Torres said there was a behavioral support plan that required weekly check-ins with the school counselor, said it in a way that made it clear the plan existed on paper and nowhere else. And when Calder asked to see the support plan, Colbert spoke for the first time to say that sharing it would violate student privacy protections. The irony of citing privacy protections after showing him a file full of redacted documents wasn't lost on anyone in the room, and Calder felt something shift in his understanding of what he was actually trying to accomplish here. He'd come to Delaware wanting proof that Tulsa had failed his daughter, wanting documentation he could use to stop the evaluation that would label Inez as the problem, and he'd found proof of something bigger and considerably less convenient. His daughter had been hurt by a child who was being hurt by a system that had decided helping was more expensive than hiding, and stopping that system from labeling Inez meant confronting the reality that the other child would keep getting moved until he ran out of grandmothers willing to take him or schools willing to accept transfer students with files this thick. Calder looked at Torres, at the way her hands had tightened on the file folder, and asked the question that he knew would cost him something he hadn't budgeted for. What would it take to actually help this boy instead of just moving him again when Sussex County decided he was too expensive to keep? The flight back to Tulsa gave Calder 6 hours to process what he'd learned in Sussex County, 6 hours to sit with the reality that solving his daughter's problem meant choosing whether to solve a stranger's too. And he didn't sleep even when the cabin lights dimmed and the flight attendants stopped coming through with offers of drinks he wouldn't have accepted anyway. He made 2 calls before the plane touched down, one to his attorney to ask questions about funding mechanisms he'd never needed to understand before, one to Maribel to ask if she'd be willing to do something that would require her to trust him in ways he hadn't yet earned. And by the time he landed, he'd made a decision that felt less like clarity and more like committing to uncertainty as a permanent condition. What he didn't know yet was whether choosing to help would cost him the thing he'd been trying to protect in the first place. The first dinner where Inez laughed happened 4 days after Calder stopped treating his house like a hotel he visited between obligations. 4 days after he'd started coming home at 5 instead of 8 and asking questions about her day that required answers longer than fine or okay. Maribel had made something with chicken and rice that smelled like cumin and citrus. And when Inez tried to explain a story about something that had happened during recess, she started giggling halfway through and couldn't finish. Couldn't get the words out because she was laughing too hard at a joke Calder didn't fully understand, but laughed at anyway because the sound of his daughter's laughter felt like proof that something could still be repaired, even after it had been broken for longer than anyone had noticed. Maribel watched from the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed but her face soft, watched in a way that suggested she was cataloguing this moment as evidence of something worth protecting, and when Calder caught her eye, she nodded once before turning back to whatever she was cleaning that didn't actually need cleaning. The nights that followed developed a rhythm that felt almost normal, felt like the kind of routine other families probably took for granted, but that Calder approached with the careful attention of someone who understood that normalcy was a privilege that required maintenance. He helped Inez with homework at the dining room table, even though she didn't actually need help, sat there working on his laptop while she worked on hers, so she'd know he was present and available, and choosing to be there instead of somewhere else. Maribel stayed later than her contracted hours, stayed because Calder had asked her to, and because she'd set conditions that required his presence as much as hers, and the three of them settled into something that looked like family, even though none of them used that word, because using it would have required acknowledging how long they'd been pretending to be one without actually functioning as one. Calder started noticing things he'd missed for years, started seeing that Inez organized her books by color instead of title, that she ate everything on her plate except foods that touched each other, that she hummed when she concentrated and stopped humming when she was worried about something she hadn't decided to share yet. He learned that Maribel drank her coffee black in the morning and with milk in the afternoon, that she kept a photograph in her wallet of a girl who looked enough like her to be the sister she'd mentioned once and never brought up again, that she flinched slightly when doors closed too hard, but had taught herself not to react in ways that would invite questions. These were small observations, details that didn't change anything material, but Calder collected them anyway because knowing them felt like the work he should have been doing all along, instead of the work that had seemed more important at the time. Subscribe before you mistake peace for resolution and discover too late that comfort was just the space between crises. The call from the school came on a Tuesday afternoon, while Inez was upstairs doing homework and Maribel was in the kitchen preparing dinner, came from Principal Hutchins in Sussex County with news delivered in the careful tone of someone who thought he was solving a problem. The district had made a decision about the other child, Hutchins explained, had determined that the most appropriate placement given the recent incidents and the ongoing concerns about safety would be a therapeutic program in a different county, a program that specialized in children with significant behavioral challenges, and the transfer would be effective immediately to ensure continuity of services and protection for all students. The language was so polished, so thoroughly emptied of humanity, that Calder felt his stomach turn before his mind caught up to what was actually being said. He asked what the child had done to trigger this decision, asked it because he needed to know if this was response to actual danger or preemptive removal disguised as intervention, and Hutchins said there had been an incident during lunch that had required administrative response, said it without providing details, without explaining whether the incident had been aggression or reaction or something that could have been prevented if anyone had bothered to implement the supports they'd promised. Calder looked through the kitchen doorway at Maribel, stirring something on the stove, looked up the stairs where his daughter was learning to feel safe again, and understood that the peace he'd been building in his house was about to cost him a decision he wasn't ready to make. If he stayed silent, Inez would be protected, and some other child would disappear into a system designed to contain rather than help. If he fought, he'd be choosing a stranger's child over the fragile stability his own daughter had just started to trust, and there was no version of this choice that didn't break something that mattered. Calder asked Maribel to get in the car 3 hours after the call from Sussex County, asked her to pack for a week and trust that he had a plan, even though what he actually had was the outline of an idea that would require her expertise and his willingness to spend money in ways that wouldn't generate returns his board could measure on spreadsheets. She looked at him across the kitchen island, where she'd been chopping vegetables for a meal they weren't going to eat on schedule, looked at him with an expression that suggested she was calculating risks that had nothing to do with logistics, and when she finally nodded and went to pack her bag, Calder understood that what he was asking wasn't participation but partnership, wasn't asking her to help him fix something, but asking her to share the cost of trying. They left before dawn the next morning, while Inez was still asleep upstairs under the care of a neighbor Calder had known for 6 years, but had never spoken to beyond pleasantries about weather and property values. And the drive east felt less like a business trip, and more like the kind of journey people take when they've decided that staying still will cost more than whatever comes from moving forward. The first meeting happened in a conference room in Springfield, Ohio, that smelled like burnt coffee and the kind of air conditioning that hadn't been serviced since installation. Happened with a behavioral specialist named Dr. Leon Prescott, who'd agreed to meet them because Calder had donated to a research program Prescott had written about in a journal Calder had never actually read. Prescott listened while Maribel explained what she'd been doing with Inez, listened to descriptions of pressure points and counting techniques and grounding exercises, and when she finished, he asked questions that weren't about whether the techniques worked, but about how she'd learned to implement them without formal training in trauma-informed care. Maribel talked about the respite center in McAlester, about the residents who'd taught her that regulation wasn't something you could force, but something you had to offer, in the exact moment when a body was ready to accept it, and Prescott made notes on a tablet while nodding in ways that suggested he was hearing something he'd been trying to teach other people for years without the right language to make it stick. Calder waited until Maribel finished before he explained what he was actually proposing, explained that he wanted to fund training programs across school districts he traveled through for work, wanted to create infrastructure that would teach teachers and administrators and support staff how to recognize when children needed regulation instead of discipline, and that he'd only fund it if the programs accepted children like the boy in Sussex County who'd been moved 4 times because moving was cheaper than helping. Prescott asked what Calder expected in return, asked it carefully, like he'd sat through enough meetings with wealthy people to know that philanthropy usually came with conditions that benefited the donor more than the recipients. And Calder said he didn't want his name on buildings or tax deductions that would let him feel good about spending money he wouldn't miss. What he wanted was safeguards, accountability, proof that the funding was actually reaching children instead of disappearing into administrative overhead. And he wanted Maribel to lead the implementation, because she understood what these children needed in ways that couldn't be learned from textbooks or certification programs. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Calder wondered if he'd miscalculated, if he'd asked for something that sounded reasonable in his head, but revealed how little he actually understood about systems that had been failing children for decades before he'd noticed they existed. Prescott looked at Maribel, not at Calder, and asked if she'd be willing to do this work, knowing it would require her to walk into rooms full of people who would question her credentials and her experience and her right to tell them how to do jobs they'd been doing poorly for years. Maribel didn't answer immediately, didn't jump at the opportunity or deflect with false modesty. And when she finally spoke, she said she'd do it if there were real protections in place. If the children who needed help actually received it, instead of getting shuffled into programs designed to look good on paper while changing nothing that mattered. Subscribe before someone with resources decides helping is too complicated and walks away. Calder spent the next 4 days driving between Harrisburg and Wilmington, sitting in meetings with district coordinators and risk management specialists and union representatives who all had reasons why what he was proposing wouldn't work in their specific contexts. And he listened to every objection without interrupting and then explained that he wasn't asking for permission. He was offering infrastructure that their districts couldn't afford to build themselves, offering it with the understanding that if they refused, they'd be choosing to keep doing what hadn't been working over trying something that might. And that choice would belong to them when the next child got hurt, because no one had taught the adults around them how to recognize what help actually looked like. The meetings in Wilmington were different because Vivian Torres was there, because she'd driven up from Sussex County with documentation about the boy who was scheduled to be transferred to a therapeutic program that specialized in containment, disguised as treatment. Torres laid out the file on the conference table in front of people who'd spent the previous hour explaining why Calder's proposal would require committee approvals and budget reallocations and timeline adjustments that wouldn't be possible until the next fiscal year. And she asked a question so simple it shouldn't have been devastating. If your own child was in this file, how long would you be willing to wait for help to arrive? The room went quiet in a way that suggested the question had landed exactly where Torres had intended it to land. And when the district superintendent finally spoke, she asked what Calder would need from them to start implementation immediately, instead of eventually. Calder said he'd need them to keep the boy in Sussex County, to implement the support plan that had been drafted but never funded, to let Maribel work directly with the teachers and staff who interacted with him daily, and to accept that if it didn't work, the failure would belong to all of them, instead of just the child who'd been failed by every adult who was supposed to protect him. The superintendent looked at her colleagues, looked at Torres, looked at Maribel sitting quietly with her hands folded on the table, and said they'd agree to a pilot program lasting 1 semester, with review points built in to assess effectiveness. It wasn't everything Calder had asked for, wasn't the kind of commitment that would survive administrative changes or budget cuts, but it was a beginning, and Maribel squeezed his hand under the table in a way that told him she understood that beginnings were all you ever got when you were trying to change systems that had been designed to resist change for as long as anyone could. Remember, the hallway outside the resource room at Sussex Central Elementary smelled like industrial floor wax, and the particular kind of silence that comes from adults holding their breath while waiting to see if something will break or hold. And Calder stood against the wall next to Vivian Torres while Maribel worked 20 feet away with 2 children who had never met each other but shared the kind of history that didn't require introduction. Inez had flown out with him the previous weekend, had agreed to come after Maribel explained that there was a boy who needed to learn what she'd learned, who needed someone to show him that counting could be something other than punishment or test scores, or the thing teachers did while waiting for you to stop disrupting class. The boy stood with his back to the wall and his hands pressed flat against the painted cinder block, pressed so hard his knuckles had gone white, and his breathing came in the kind of shallow bursts that Calder had learned to recognize as the prelude to either shutdown or explosion, depending on what happened in the next 60 seconds. Maribel didn't move closer. She stayed at a distance that gave the boy space to bolt if he needed to bolt, stayed there with her own hands visible and empty, and when she started counting in Spanish, she did it so quietly that Calder had to strain to hear the numbers, even though he was close enough to see the tension in the boy's shoulders. close enough to see the way his fingers flexed and released against the wall, like he was testing whether the surface would hold him or let him fall through into whatever he was trying not to feel. Inez watched from her position near the door, watched without moving or speaking, and when Maribel reached 8 and paused, Inez picked up the count at 9, her voice steadier than it had been 6 months ago when Calder had first heard her counting in his living room, steadier because she'd learned that counting wasn't about reaching an end point, but about creating space between the trigger and the response. Space where choice could exist even when your body was telling you that choice had already been taken away. The boy's breathing started to slow somewhere around 12, started to match the rhythm of the counting in a way that suggested his nervous system was accepting what his conscious mind probably still rejected. And by the time they reached 16, his hands had started to ease off the wall, had started to lower by degrees so small that Calder wouldn't have noticed the movement if he hadn't been watching for it. Maribel asked in English if he could feel his feet on the floor, asked it without expectation or judgment, and the boy nodded once without turning around, nodded, and then asked in a voice so quiet it barely carried across the hallway whether he was supposed to keep counting or stop. Maribel said he could stop whenever his body told him it was safe to stop, said it in a way that made stopping his decision instead of hers. And the boy stood there for another 30 seconds before his hands finally came away from the wall and hung at his sides, fingers still trembling slightly, but no longer locked in the kind of grip that came from believing the wall was the only thing between him and falling. Inez took 3 steps forward, stopped when she was close enough to be present, but not so close that proximity would feel like pressure, and asked the boy if he wanted to see the notebook where she kept track of places and numbers and things that helped when nothing else did. He turned slowly, like someone who'd learned that sudden movements carried consequences, and looked at Inez with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral, but couldn't quite hide the hope underneath. She held out the brown spiral-bound notebook that Calder had found in her backpack months ago, the one with diagrams and dates and Maribel's handwriting mixed with her own, and when the boy reached for it his hands were steadier than they'd been 60 seconds earlier. He opened it to a random page and stared at the drawing of pressure points marked with arrows and numbers, stared at it long enough that Calder wondered if he understood what he was looking at, or if the notebook was just another thing adults were trying to make him use, because they didn't know what else to do. Then the boy asked which number helped most when you felt like your chest was too small for your lungs. Asked it in the specific language of someone who knew exactly what that feeling was called, but had never had anyone acknowledge that the feeling was real and manageable instead of shameful and permanent. Inez pointed to the spot between thumb and forefinger, said, pressing there for 20 seconds, while counting helped her remember that breathing was something her body knew how to do, even when her brain forgot. And the boy pressed his thumb into the webbing of his opposite hand and started counting under his breath in English this time, counting while his shoulders dropped 2 inches and his jaw unclenched, and his breathing evened out into something that looked less like fighting and more like existing. Subscribe before you forget that the most important interventions don't announce themselves as heroic. Vivian Torres wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and pretended it was dust from the construction happening in the East Wing. Pretended because admitting she was crying would require acknowledging that she'd been doing this work for 11 years and had never seen what she was seeing now. Had never watched children teach each other regulation techniques in a hallway while the adults who were supposed to have taught them stood back and bore witness to their own obsolescence. Calder didn't speak, didn't move, didn't do anything that would interrupt what was happening in front of him, because he understood in a way he hadn't understood before, that this wasn't about him or his money or his ability to fund programs that looked impressive on paper. This was about a boy whose hands had been pressed against a wall, learning that walls could be temporary instead of permanent, about a girl who'd spent months being afraid, learning that fear didn't have to be the story that defined her, about an adult who'd been dismissed from a job, learning that her knowledge had value that couldn't be measured in credentials or certifications. Maribel stood near the resource room door with her arms crossed, not in defensiveness, but in the posture of someone who was watching something she'd helped create and was allowing herself to feel the weight of that creation without diminishing it through false modesty or deflection. The school counselor, who'd been observing from inside the resource room, stepped into the hallway and asked if this was something that could be taught to the other staff. Asked it in a way that suggested the question wasn't theoretical but urgent. And Maribel said yes, but only if the staff understood that teaching techniques without addressing why children needed them was just another way of avoiding the actual work. The boy closed the notebook carefully, closed it like something that mattered instead of something disposable, and handed it back to Inez with a thank you that came out rough but genuine. Inez said he could borrow it if he wanted to practice, said she had the numbers memorized now anyway, and the boy nodded and tucked the notebook under his arm like he was carrying something fragile that he didn't want to break. Calder watched his daughter walk back to where he and Torres were standing, watched the way she moved without the careful tension that had characterized her body language for months, and understood that what he was seeing wasn't resolution, but the beginning of something that would require continued attention and resources, and willingness to stay present even when presence was inconvenient. Torres asked if he was planning to stay through the end of the pilot program, or if this was the kind of intervention where wealthy people showed up for the dramatic moment and then disappeared when the work got tedious and unglamorous. And Calder heard the challenge in her voice, heard the years of disappointment that had taught her to expect abandonment disguised as charity. He said he'd stay as long as Maribel needed him to stay, said he'd keep funding the program as long as it was actually helping children instead of just creating the appearance of help, and that if Sussex County decided the pilot wasn't worth continuing, he'd find other districts that were willing to try, because walking away now would mean accepting that the system's inertia was stronger than his willingness to push against it. Torres looked at him for a long moment, looked at him the way people do when they're trying to decide whether to trust someone who's given them no evidence beyond words, and then she asked if he understood that staying would cost more than money, would cost time and attention, and the kind of sustained commitment that didn't fit easily into quarterly board meetings or annual reports. Calder looked at Inez, at the boy holding her notebook, at Maribel standing in the hallway of a school 4 states away from where this had started, and said he was beginning to understand that the cost of not staying would be considerably higher than whatever it cost to remain. Calder stood in the parking lot of a middle school in Cedar Rapids on a Tuesday in March, with his phone showing 17 missed calls, and Maribel beside him saying they needed to talk before he went into the next meeting. Needed to talk, because what had happened in Louisville the previous week was going to keep happening unless they changed their approach. The Louisville district had taken his funding, had sent 40 teachers through Maribel's training, had produced documentation showing implementation across 12 schools, and then 3 weeks later, a child had been restrained by security guards in a hallway while teachers who'd been trained to recognize panic responses had stood by and watched, because district policy required security intervention for any student who refused verbal de-escalation. The child was 11. The security guards had held him face down on linoleum that still showed scuff marks from where his shoes had dragged, and Maribel had driven 8 hours back to Louisville to stand in a principal's office and ask what the point of training was if policy prohibited teachers from using what they'd learned. The principal had explained about liability and union contracts and the difference between what teachers were permitted to do versus what security personnel were authorized to handle, had explained it in language so careful and legally vetted that Maribel had walked out mid-sentence and called Calder from the parking lot to say she was done, was finished standing in front of people who cared more about protecting institutions than protecting children. Calder had talked her into staying on one condition, had promised they'd only work with districts willing to change policy alongside training, willing to put in writing that regulation techniques took precedence over restraint protocols, and now he was standing in Iowa, about to walk into a meeting where he'd have to explain to a superintendent that money came with conditions she probably wouldn't accept. Maribel asked if he was ready to lose this district over a principle that might cost them access to children who needed help, even if the help came within systems that remained fundamentally broken. And Calder said he didn't know, but that continuing without conditions meant funding performance instead of change. The meeting lasted 90 minutes and ended with the superintendent saying she'd need to consult with the board, which translated to no in language designed to avoid actually saying it. And when Calder and Maribel drove to Fort Wayne that afternoon, they did it in silence that felt heavier than conversation would have managed. Subscribe before inaction becomes the safest choice. Maribel broke the quiet somewhere past the Illinois border to say that she'd been wrong about the Louisville district, had believed their commitment was genuine because she'd wanted to believe it, and Calder said he'd been wrong too, had assumed that funding was sufficient leverage, when what actually mattered was whether administrators were willing to risk the discomfort that came from challenging systems they'd spent careers learning to navigate. The Fort Wayne meeting went better because the district coordinator had worked in residential treatment before moving into administration, had seen what happened to children when restraint became standard procedure, and when she asked how quickly they could start implementation, Calder felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight since Louisville. There were victories in places he hadn't expected them, and failures in districts that had seemed promising. And Calder learned that predicting which was which required better instincts than he'd developed in business, where success followed predictable patterns of capital and strategy. A district outside Pittsburgh implemented Maribel's training and then promoted the one administrator who'd resisted it to Director of Student Services, effectively ending the program without officially cancelling it. A rural district in Kentucky with a budget smaller than Calder's quarterly travel expenses became a model for implementation because the superintendent had a grandson who'd been restrained in second grade and understood that policy that prioritized adult comfort over child safety was policy that needed changing, regardless of what it cost politically. Calder spent April traveling between states, spent May testifying at a school board meeting in Columbus, where parents accused him of interfering with discipline that kept their children safe from classmates they described as violent, when the actual evidence suggested those classmates were responding to trauma that no one had addressed, because addressing it required resources districts had decided weren't worth allocating. Inez flew to Delaware in June to spend a week working with students at Sussex Central. Flew alone this time because Calder had meetings in Newark he couldn't reschedule, and Maribel was training teachers in Fort Wayne. And when he picked her up at the airport the following Sunday, she told him about a girl in 4th grade who'd asked if regulation techniques worked on parents who yelled, asked it in a way that suggested the question wasn't theoretical. Inez had said she didn't know, but that counting helped her remember that other people's anger didn't have to become her responsibility, and the girl had written down the numbers 1 through 16 on her hand in marker that hadn't washed off by the time her mother picked her up from school. Torres had called that evening to say the girl's mother had asked for information about the program, had asked in a voice that carried the weight of someone recognizing their own need in their daughter's question. And Calder had added adult caregiver training to the list of things he was funding, without knowing if it would work, but knowing that not trying guaranteed it wouldn't. He missed Inez's middle school orientation in August because a flight from Louisville got delayed by weather and then cancelled altogether. Missed it and called from the airport to apologize, and heard in her silence the accumulation of every other time he'd chosen wrong. Maribel answered when Inez handed her the phone, answered and said that Inez had asked whether her dad would be at the orientation 3 times over 2 days, and then stopped asking. And the familiar pattern of that stopping felt like evidence that some things hadn't changed as much as Calder had convinced himself they had. He drove home from Oklahoma City at midnight and found Inez's orientation packet on the kitchen counter with a note in her handwriting that said she'd picked her electives without him. Said it in language that was factual but carried subtext about all the other things she'd learned to do without him while he was occupied with helping other people's children. The Sussex County program got extended through another year after the district presented data showing reduced suspension rates and improved attendance among students who'd previously been chronically absent, presented it in language Calder had learned to recognize as bureaucracy, translating human improvement into metrics that justified continued spending. Torres sent updates that were less formal now, sent them with photographs of the boy who'd stood against that hallway wall, teaching a 6th grader how to count in Spanish, teaching with the kind of authority that came from lived experience rather than certification. The boy was still struggling, still had days where regulation techniques weren't sufficient and crisis protocols had to be activated. But he hadn't been moved in 8 months, and his IEP had finally been funded after his mother testified at a district meeting about working night shifts at a plant where missing time meant losing the job that kept them housed. Maribel called from a hotel in Louisville at 2 in the morning on a Thursday in September, called because she'd just walked out of a training session where a teacher had asked what to do when parents refused to believe their children needed regulation support. Refused because accepting it meant acknowledging trauma they'd caused or failed to prevent. Maribel had said that some parents would never be ready to hear that their children were suffering, that the work wasn't to convince parents but to provide children with tools they could use regardless of whether adults acknowledged the need, and the teacher had responded by saying that sounded like giving up on families. Maribel had tried to explain the difference between giving up and accepting limits, had tried to articulate that helping children didn't require fixing everything that was broken in their lives, but the words had felt insufficient against the weight of expectation that solutions should be comprehensive rather than partial. Calder asked if she wanted to stop, asked it because he needed to know if the cost of continuing had exceeded whatever they were accomplishing, and Maribel said she didn't know how to stop when there were still children who needed what she could teach, even if what she could teach wasn't sufficient to fix systems that had been failing them for longer than she'd been alive. She said the boy in Sussex had asked if she'd come back in October, had asked in a way that suggested he'd learned not to expect promises to be kept but still hoped they might be, and Calder said he'd make sure she could go, would clear whatever schedule conflicts existed, because this was the work that mattered, even when mattering didn't translate to transformation at the scale they'd hoped for when they started. The story doesn't end with resolution because the work doesn't end, doesn't culminate in the kind of systemic change that would let anyone declare victory and move on to other causes. Calder still travels between districts trying to convince administrators that caring about children should be sufficient motivation without needing financial incentives. Maribel still trains teachers who want to help and encounters resistance from those who view additional training as criticism of methods they've used for decades. Inez still counts when transitions feel overwhelming, still carries techniques she shouldn't need in schools that were supposed to keep her safe. There are children who don't get moved because someone finally intervened, teachers who recognize trauma and respond with regulation, districts that implement policy changes that prioritize children over institutional protection. But there are also children who fall through gaps that training can't close, districts that take funding and then revert to practices that created the problems in the first place, administrators who perform commitment while maintaining systems designed to exclude rather than support. The choice isn't between fixing everything or walking away, isn't between complete transformation or accepting defeat, but between showing up consistently when outcomes remain uncertain and disappearing when the work becomes tedious and unglamorous. Some interventions don't announce themselves as heroic, don't generate the dramatic change that would make them satisfying as conclusions. They ask you to count while meaning catches up, ask you to stay when staying costs more than leaving, ask you to accept that the most important work is the kind that continues after urgency fades, and only the people who never had the option to leave remain.